Okay, in this video we're going to go over the parts and surfaces of the humerus, the radius, and the ulna. We will start with the humerus. Our biggest long bone of the arms. And we will start with the tubercles. Let's hide everything else, zoom in, and just quickly to point out a couple of things, be able to differentiate between what is the anterior aspect, what is the posterior aspect, which way is medial, which way is lateral. Expect to be thrown one of these bones and to be able to differentiate between whether this is the left one or the right humerus. The greater tubercle, so our tubercles are going to be up here. And remember, tubercles are kind of rounded extensions, protrusions that have muscles that insert into them. So the greater tubercle is, of course, the larger one of the two. So this is an anterior aspect. Medials to the left, laterals to the right. And there is our greater tubercle. And remember, you could always pause the video and kind of read these descriptions. They're really good. But the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, the teres minor muscles, they all insert into the greater tubercle. The lesser tubercle, which is more anterior, is that guy right there. And they're pretty hard to miss, these two big bumps. So that's the greater tubercle, the lesser tubercle. The anatomical neck is just superior to the tubercle. So it's actually this circumference there. So I'll rotate this around. So it's going to border the superior parts of the tubercles and the head, which we'll get to in a second. But let's contrast that with the surgical neck, which is all of this area here. So the surgical neck is going to lie inferior to the tubercles and the anatomical neck. The head is this large part here. And that's going to fit right into the glenoid cavity of the scapula. The shaft is the length of the bone. And now let's talk about the condyle. Remember, condyles are kind of those rounded protrusions that articulate with other bones. And it is this entire smooth structure here that is the condyle of the humerus. And we can divide them further into this rounded part, which is the capitulum, which is on the lateral side. So this is an anterior aspect, lateral, medial. That is the capitulum of the humerus, or the capitulum of the condyle of the humerus. And then the trochlea is medial. So that is the trochlea of the condyle of the humerus. And a good question would be as to whether or not you need to specify if it's on the condyle for our quizzes. We should look into that. But it would definitely be of the humerus. Okay, so the lateral and medial epicondyles. Epi is the Greek word for on or upon. So epicondyle would be upon the condyle. And we'll have to switch to surfaces. So if this is our medial aspect, and this is on the condyle, this is probably our medial epicondyle. So that is this kind of process that sticks out on the medial aspect of the humerus. And I'll rotate that around. So this is posterior, anterior. The lateral epicondyle will be on the other side. This is lateral, the lateral aspect, anterior, and posterior. Okay, so fossa, remember, are those shallow depressions. The olecranon fossa will be on the posterior aspect of the humerus, and it is this nice deep fossa right there, so superior to the condyle on the distal end of the humerus, posterior. We will see how the olecranon process of the ulna fits in right there. The coronoid fossa will be on the anterior aspect, and it is the one that is superior to the trochlea and is medial. So that is the coronoid fossa. You can tell that there are these two dips. One dip rises up, two dips, and those are the fossa. And the lateral fossa is the radial fossa. The last term for the humerus is a little difficult to identify sometimes on real bones. But to give you a sense of where to begin looking, it is on the shaft, and it is a posterior lateral groove. So let's go posterior on the shaft and lateral. And you can kind of see this raised groove along the bone, and you can definitely feel it on a real bone. And it is kind of midway along the shaft. That is the groove for the radial nerve. Down here so you could read it a little. But that is your radial groove. So posterior lateral. Not easy to say. So those are your parts and surfaces for the humerus. Let's go to the radial bone. The radial bone is, and remember, anatomical position, you have the palms outwards, and that's going to be pretty useful to remember when you're trying to figure out which bone is which side is which. So remember that the palms are outwards in anatomical position, and when that occurs, you have your radial bone on the lateral aspect. The ulna is medial. So let's look at the ulna. Let's look at the parts. We'll start with the radial head. I might have misspoken. Did I? This is the radius. Not giving me everything I want. There we go. Parts. Weird. Okay, so that is the head of the radius right up there. You can tell it's nice and rounded, and how the capitulum would fit perfectly in there and articulate with the radius. Remember, the capitulum is that rounded part of the condyle of the humerus, and that'll articulate very nicely in there. The neck of the radius is not that part here. It is this part just below, just inferior to the articular circumference of the radius, but that's not a term we need to know. So we can just go from the head to the neck of the radius. The radial tuberosity, remember tuberosity is a new term. It's another kind of rough surface where muscles can insert. So the radial tuberosity here, tuberosity, tubercle sounds similar, so that's useful. Okay, there we go. So again, this is a anterior view, and the radial tuberosity is this smooth, well, not smooth, it's a rough but flat kind of part that's on the lateral side inferior to the neck of the radius. The styloid process of the radius is going to be on the distal end, and it's going to be this rounded angled protrusion. That is the styloid process of the radius, not to be confused with the styloid process of the temporal bone, which is thin and pointy. That's a lateral view. Finally, the ulnar notch is going to be on the medial aspect of the bone, and it will be this part right here, and that is where the ulna is going to articulate with the radius, at least on the distal end. So there's our ulnar notch on the medial aspect, styloid process on the lateral aspect. Okay, our final long bone of the arm is going to be our ulna. The olecranon process of the ulna is going to be right up here. It's going to be this really cool looking head right there. So that in magenta is the olecranon process of the ulna. The trochlear notch is going to be this, most of this entire surface in there, and that is going to articulate with the trochlea of the condyle of the humerus. And you'll see how this part is going to fit into the olecranon fossa. The ulnar tuberosity, again, look for a rough kind of surface that's flatter, where muscle will insert. And it's going to be there, just inferior to the olecranon. Well, actually, this is the coronoid process. We'll get to that in a second. So that is our ulnar tuberosity. The styloid process of the ulna is also going to be at the distal end, and it's also going to be the kind of pointy protrusion. There's the styloid process of the ulna. Coronoid process of the ulna will be this guy right here. Remember, that's the olecranon process. The coronoid process is below on the other side, inferior. And then our last surface is the radial notch, which will also be on the distal end. No, excuse me, the radial notch is on the proximal end, because the radius will articulate there. So be careful to differentiate the two. This part right here is going to be the more lateral side, and that is going to be the radial notch, whereas this is the trochlear notch. You have two processes here, the olecranon process and the coronoid process. And your radial tuberosity is right in here. So let's highlight our three bones and get a sense of how they all fit in together. So you can see right here where the radius is going to articulate in the radial notch of the ulna. And then if we go to the distal end, here's the ulnar notch. Contrast that to the radial notch. So this is the ulnar notch of the radius, and that'll articulate with our ulnar bone. Now let's bring them all together and take a look at how they articulate with the humerus. So there's the capitulum. Remember, this is an anterior view, medial, lateral. The capitulum of the condyle of the humerus articulates with the head of the radius. This is the coronoid process of the ulna, articulating with the trochlea. And remember, that's the trochlear notch in there, so the trochlea fits right in there. And then on the posterior aspect, check out how our olecranon process fits right into the olecranon fossa of the humerus. Okay. And then the last thing I'll show you is just, again, kind of the proximal end of the humerus, so I can show you how the head articulates in the glenoid cavity of the scapula.